Hi there, I'm B. I'm a writer and a dreamer. I have fun making these videos, and it would be great if you can show your support by liking our videos, commenting, and subscribing to our channel. Thank you.
The thing about the Vigilant Eclipse was that it didn't look like much, if you could even see it at all. Most people couldn't. In fact, the only beings who had ever seen the eclipse were usually in the middle of a nervous breakdown and swearing it had eyes. Which it didn't. Probably. It didn't roar into battle. It didn't light up scanners with flashy weapon signatures. It didn't even bother with the usual chest thumping by the authority of the Terran Navy comms transmissions. The Eclipse preferred the art of complete and utter silence. Not the kind of silence that makes you strain to listen. No, this was the kind that made you start imagining noises just to fill the void. It was a warship that treated combat the way a cat treats knocking a glass off a table. Entirely optional, vaguely amused, and slightly bored. Inside, the crew weren't pacing around in crisp uniforms or shouting orders. They were lounging. Comfortable, low lighting, mugs of coffee in hand, boots kicked up on consoles that would make alien engineers faint. No one was screaming brace for impact, because the Eclipse didn't do impacts. Impacts were for ships that had to work for a living. The Eclipse, on the other hand, had mastered the fine Terran art of letting other people do all the heavy lifting, preferably against each other. The ship's captain, Commander Rincalder, had perfected the look of someone who couldn't be bothered. He had the relaxed posture of a man who just found out that his enemies were trapped in a room full of marbles and he'd forgotten to warn them about the stairs. His crew mirrored that energy. They didn't think of themselves as warriors in the traditional sense. They were more like stage directors, except their theater was a combat zone and the actors didn't know they were performing. The Eclipse didn't bristle with guns or missile bays, at least not visibly. If you managed to get a visual, which again meant you were either hallucinating or very unlucky, it was just a sleek, unmarked hull gliding through space, the sort of vessel that could have been a freighter, a patrol ship, or a really fancy coffin. The point was to give nothing away. The moment the enemy thought they had it figured out, the game was already over. Its arsenal wasn't physical in the usual sense. No railguns, no plasma lances, no massive energy spikes. What it did have were swarms of invisible nanodrones, smaller than a dust mote and quieter than guilt. They weren't built to destroy anything directly. They were built to listen, to slip into enemy ships, crawl through ventilation ducts, and nestle inside comm arrays. Then they waited. The moment someone on that enemy vessel thought, that ship is hostile, we should attack, the drones tagged it. Not just the thought, the emotion behind it, the flashes of imagined destruction, the fear, the anger. They wrapped that thought up like a gift, stuffed it with every sensory detail they could glean, and filed it away for later delivery. This was the black box part of the Eclipse's reputation. Every hostile intention got recorded. And the thing about thoughts is they hit harder when you see them reflected back at you. But the real genius was the delivery. The Eclipse didn't send those recorded moments back as grainy video feeds or intercepted comms. No, it sent them back as hallucinations, full sensory, fully believable, slotted seamlessly into the enemy's perception of reality. 1 minute you're staring at the reassuring sight of your fleet's flagship. The next, you're watching it turn its guns on you, hearing your admiral order your destruction, smelling the acrid burn of ozone from a plasma barrage. It didn't matter that none of it was happening, your brain swore it was. And if your brain said it, your trigger finger usually agreed. In the early days, no one outside the Terran Navy even knew the Eclipse existed. Official records claimed it was an advanced recon vessel that never saw direct combat. Most alien powers dismissed it as human propaganda, a ghost story to keep enemy fleets awake at night, which was exactly how humanity wanted it. The fewer people who believed, the better it worked. Those who had encountered it, if you could call accidentally killing half your own fleet an encounter, rarely wanted to talk about it. They'd be ridiculed for suggesting that an invisible Terran warship had somehow made them turn on each other without firing a single shot. The Varn Confederacy dismissed the first report entirely, chalking it up to low discipline and high alcohol consumption among its crews. That fleet had been found drifting, silent, With barely a survivor who could string a coherent sentence together. The logs were even stranger. Identical entries in multiple ships reporting the same betrayal from entirely different angles, all insisting they had visual confirmation. The reality was simple. The Eclipse didn't fight fair, and it didn't care. Its crew didn't get medals for accuracy or precision strikes. Their reward was the sight, on hidden surveillance feeds, of enemy captains screaming at each other, ships firing blind into their own lines, and admirals begging for ceasefires from ships that weren't even there. It was a slow, creeping kind of warfare. You didn't feel a hit. You just started doubting. Doubting your sensors, doubting your orders, doubting the loyalty of the ship next to you. You didn't need a missile to blow a fleet apart. You just needed to convince them the danger was coming from inside the house. And humans were uniquely qualified to deliver that message, having spent centuries perfecting the art of mutual distrust in their own history. Back in the Eclipse's crew lounge, a term loosely applied to a space littered with coffee mugs, card games, and half-assembled drone schematics, they had a saying: "We don't sink ships. We sink friendships." Calder liked to repeat it before every operation, just to set the mood. Of course, the real joke was that the crew never actually saw the battles in person. The Eclipse stayed well out of range, parked in deep shadow, or tucked behind some unremarkable asteroid, its drones doing the legwork. The combat feeds were just delayed relays piped into the lounge, often accompanied by commentary that would have been wildly inappropriate for any other military setting. Watching an alien flagship tear itself apart because its captain thought his first officer was plotting mutiny was basically primetime entertainment. Every so often, a new recruit, fresh from the academy, full of noble ideas about honor in combat, would ask why the Eclipse didn't just fight directly. Calder would give them the same answer every time. Why wrestle a bear when you can just whisper in its ear that all the other bears are out to get it? And that was the point. The Eclipse wasn't built to be the biggest, fastest, or deadliest warship in the galaxy. It was built to be the most annoying, the kind of ship that didn't just win battles. It made sure its enemies lost sleep for the rest of their lives. It didn't inspire fear the way a massive dreadnought did. It inspired paranoia, which was far more corrosive. Somewhere out there, alien fleets were drilling against phantom tactics, holding briefings on Eclipse protocol, issuing orders to trust no one without triple verification. None of it mattered. You couldn't fight something that didn't even have to be present to destroy you. And so the Eclipse drifted on, silent and unseen, sipping coffee in the dark, waiting for the next set of ships to start doubting themselves to death. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't noble. But it was very, very human. And for the crew of the Vigilant Eclipse, that was exactly the point. They called them Nanodrones, but that made them sound like polite, industrious little helpers, the kind you might use to scrub a hull or clean a coffee filter. In reality, the Eclipse's Nanodrones were more like invisible gremlins with PhDs in psychological warfare. If they'd had a marketing department, their slogan would have been something like, "We don't kill you, we make you kill each other." They were small enough to pass through the filters of most alien life support systems without so much as a cough from the crew. 1,000,000,000,000 of them could sit on the tip of your finger, and you wouldn't notice until your own thoughts started turning against you. The drones didn't shine, didn't hum, didn't show up on any scan short of a molecular sweep, and by the time you're performing one of those, it was already too late. Deployment was simple. The Eclipse would drift somewhere in the general neighborhood of the target, light years away sometimes, if Calder was feeling lazy, and open one of the side bays like it was just taking a casual breath. Out they went, a cloud of nothing, riding on stray solar winds or tucked into the exhaust plumes of passing debris. Within hours, they'd be inside the ventilation shafts, sensor relays, comm buoys, and even the artificial gravity regulators of the enemy's ships. No alarms, no hull breach detected, just silence. The drones didn't hack systems. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. Instead, they hacked something far more vulnerable, the squishy, overconfident brains of whatever unfortunate life forms made up the opposing fleet. First, they listened. Every word, every comm, every unspoken flicker of suspicion. Their programming was simple in philosophy, but devastating in execution. Look for hostility toward the Eclipse and tag it. It didn't have to be loud or obvious. An officer could just glance at a blank patch of space and think that human ship is out there somewhere. That was enough. The drones would record the thought like gossip at a dinner party, storing not just the words but the emotional texture. And they didn't just stop at the one thought. Once tagged, a target's brain became an open archive. Every stray worry, every fantasy about opening fire, every paranoid musing about betrayal, it all went into the drone's invisible library. What the target smelled in that moment, what they were touching, the way their voice caught when they whispered to themselves, it all got filed away for later. Later was where the real magic happened. The drones didn't attack immediately. That would have been too quick, too kind. No, they waited. Hours, days, sometimes weeks, until the moment was perfect. They'd choose the exact time when the fleet was at peak tension. Maybe a supply run had gone wrong. Maybe a patrol hadn't reported back. Maybe someone's dinner tasted a little off, and now everyone was side-eyeing the cook. Whatever the reason, the drones would watch and wait for the pressure to build, then slip the knife in. The knife wasn't a weapon. It was a memory fed back into the victim's mind, but edited with all the loving attention of a Terran dramatist. The drones didn't just replay a captain's thought about being attacked. They made it real. Not metaphorically. Not, oh, that was a vivid dream. Real, as in, the captain would see their own flagship turning its guns on them. Hear the screaming over comms. Feel the heat of non-existent explosions washing over their skin. Their senses would sell the lie so completely that they'd react the only way they could, by fighting back. It spread like fire in a dry forest. One hallucination would lead to a counterattack, which would lead to a retaliation, which would lead to 3 other ships swearing they'd seen the same thing and opening fire in solidarity. No one stopped to question why their sensors didn't match what they were seeing. No one had time. This was combat, and the enemy was right there, except it wasn't. The enemy was sitting in a lounge light years away, sipping lukewarm coffee and taking bets on which ship would go up first. The most beautiful part, from Calder's perspective, was that the Eclipse didn't have to know how the battle ended. It didn't matter if the fleet tore itself apart in 10 minutes or limped away after hours of fratricide. Either way, the job was done, and not a single shot had been fired from the Eclipse itself. The first time they tested the system, it was on a small raiding party from the Varkel Dominion. 3 ships, mid-range armament. Confident. Too confident. The drones tagged the captain of the lead vessel within 20 minutes of entry, picking up a stray thought about catching the humans off guard. 2 days later, that same captain was watching a hallucinated barrage from his second-in-command's ship tear through his engines. He panicked, returned fire, and 30 seconds later the 3rd vessel joined in, sure it had seen the first 2 conspiring against it. The whole thing was over in under 4 minutes. No survivors worth interrogating. When the Eclipse's crew replayed the captured footage later, Calder just grinned and said, "That's almost too easy. Like fishing in a swimming pool." Of course, once words started leaking out, fragmented reports, garbled survivor testimonies, alien powers scrambled to find countermeasures. The Zarathi tried using emotion-suppressing drugs on their crews, which worked right up until the hallucinations included the ship's AI calmly announcing that it had decided to side with the humans. The Lorash Collective attempted to issue orders through automated relays instead of living officers, but the drones simply replayed memories of the relays being compromised, and, well, let's just say it's hard to keep formation when you've convinced yourself the navigation system is trying to drive you into a sun. The thing no one seemed to understand was that the drones didn't need to invent fear, they just needed to feed it back at the right moment. And every species had fear. They could wrap it in honor codes, bury it under centuries of military tradition, or pretend their culture had moved beyond such primal emotions. It didn't matter. Fear was universal, and so was the human talent for exploiting it. The Terran Navy's analysts started calling the tactic psychological fratricide. Calder preferred the galaxy's longest-running practical joke. His crew called it Tuesday. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked, and no one, not even the brightest alien tacticians, could figure out how to fight something they couldn't see, hear, smell, or even prove existed. Some alien strategists theorized that the Eclipse itself was just a decoy, and the real weapon was hidden somewhere deep in Terran space. Others claimed it was a rogue AI with a grudge against the galaxy. A few whispered that the humans had found a way to weaponize ghosts. Calder and his crew didn't correct anyone. Let the myths grow. The bigger the legend, the more the paranoia did their work for them. By the time the drones finished their work, most fleets weren't in any condition to pursue the Eclipse, physically or mentally. And if they were, there was nothing to pursue. The ship was already gone, the drones reclaimed, the battlefield littered with wreckage that told a dozen contradictory stories. Investigators would piece together logs that didn't match sensor data that didn't match physical damage, and survivors whose testimony contradicted itself mid-sentence. And somewhere, far away, in the quiet hum of the Eclipse's lounge, Calder would sip his coffee, lean back in his chair, and murmur, "They'll blame themselves in the end." They always do. The Varkel Dominion was not a species prone to self-doubt. They were tall, armored, perpetually frowning lizard beasts with voices like gravel being poured over metal, and they had spent centuries convincing themselves they were the galaxy's natural military aristocracy. Their ships were massive, angular slabs of alloy with no curves, no artistry, no frills, just weapons and engines strapped together with the sole purpose of pointing themselves at other civilizations and daring them to flinch. The Dominion's high command had dismissed the rumors about the Vigilant Eclipse as human melodrama. They didn't believe in ghost ships. They didn't believe in invisible weapons. They definitely didn't believe in psychological warfare because in their minds, psychology was something you inflicted physically with boarding hooks and high explosives. And so, when one of their border fleets reported anomalous contacts near Terran space, the response from High Command was swift and arrogant. Deploy the 9th Striking Wing. 12 capital ships, 20 escorts, and a full carrier group. Enough firepower to convince any lurking Terran vessel to either fight like a warrior or flee like a coward. The Eclipse didn't either. It sat in shadow, just far enough outside their long-range sensors to be probably not there, and breathed its nanodrone cloud into the void. By the time the Varkel fleet crossed into Terran space, those drones were already sprinkled through their ventilation ducts, hiding in sensor conduits, and at that very moment, listening in on every conversation. It didn't take long for the tagging to begin. The Varkel weren't exactly subtle creatures. They didn't have an inside voice in their thoughts. A bridge officer thinking, "We should be ready for an ambush," might as well have been screaming, "The humans are here," into a loudspeaker. The drones tagged it. Another officer, annoyed at the carrier's commander for not launching fighters early, imagined the fleet being caught flat-footed and blamed him in advance. Tagged. The flagship's captain, irritated by his Exos tone, idly pictured replacing him after this operation. Tagged. For 2 full days, nothing happened. The Varkel moved deeper into the sector, scanning, probing, posturing. No Terran ships appeared. No weapons fired. That was by design. Calder and the crew were waiting, letting the fleet marinate in its own paranoia. The lounge had popcorn on rotation. When the drones finally began playback, they didn't go for the big, dramatic attack right away. They started small. The first hallucination was barely noticeable. The lead cruiser's gunnery officer swore he saw a Terran signature blink onto his targeting scope for a split second before vanishing. No one else saw it, but he insisted. It was written off as a sensor ghost. Then, the destroyer's comms officer heard an open-channel transmission, garbled, distorted, but clearly in the voice of the carrier's captain, ordering the fleet to prepare for unconventional fire control procedures. The captain denied it, but the destroyer's crew logged the incident anyway. That's when the first real playback hit. The fleet's flagship captain looked up from his tactical display to see the destroyer pivot its guns toward him. Every indicator on his panel confirmed the weapons were hot. In reality, the destroyer was cruising along normally, but his eyes swore otherwise. He barked for evasive maneuvers and ordered an immediate return volley. The destroyer's captain, suddenly under fire from his own flagship, reacted as any loyal Dominion warrior would. He decided his commander had lost his mind and needed to be put down. 2 more ships joined in, claiming they'd seen the same betrayal. Within 30 seconds, the fleet had fractured into 3 distinct factions, each convinced the other 2 had turned traitor. The Eclipse didn't have to feed them much after that. Once the first hallucinations were reinforced by actual, physical weapons fire, the crew's brains did the rest. Calder just leaned back in his chair, watching the sensor feed of bright blossoms of detonations across the sector. It's like giving them one drink and letting them find the bar themselves, he mused. By the 6-minute mark, the carrier group had detected a full squadron of Terran frigates. Another playback lifted directly from the carrier's own captain's thoughts. His crew launched every fighter they had, screaming for vengeance, only to plow directly into the Dominion's own cruisers. The fighters, convinced they were under counterattack from stealth ships, began firing wildly into the melee. On the bridge of the Varkel's Pride, the fleet admiral was shouting into a dead comm channel, ordering a ceasefire that no one was hearing, because half his bridge crew now saw him as a human infiltrator in disguise. 2 of them drew sidearms. The admiral's last words, according to the black box, were, "The humans aren't even here." The Eclipse's crew replayed that moment 3 times. One destroyer tried to disengage entirely, boosting for open space. The drones, sensing an opportunity for artistry, fed its captain the image of the entire Dominion home fleet burning in orbit, courtesy of his inaction. That destroyer turned around and charged the nearest traitor cruiser head-on, detonating both ships in a mutual kill. By the 10th minute, the battlefield was a scrapyard of drifting hulls and venting atmosphere. The remaining ships, battered and confused, began retreating in opposite directions, none of them aware that the others were also fleeing. The drones recorded every thought, every shout, every desperate order, ready to be played back for the next target. Calder let the survivors go. Not because of mercy, he wanted them to live long enough to deliver the worst possible message back home. That the Terrans had a ghost ship, that it could be anywhere, and that it didn't have to shoot to kill. The Varkel Dominion never publicly admitted to what happened. The official report blamed communication interference and sensor manipulation by multiple stealth-class Terran vessels. Conveniently, no evidence of those vessels was ever found. The crews who survived were quietly reassigned, preferably somewhere far from each other, and none were allowed to serve in the same fleet again. High Command thought that would stop the paranoia from spreading. It didn't. Within months, any time a Varkel ship's sensors glitched, someone would mutter about the Eclipse. If a fleet maneuver went wrong, the Eclipse. If a captain had a bad dream, the Eclipse. A cargo hauler in a totally unrelated sector once reported seeing a human ship drifting just beyond visual range and was immediately quarantined for psychological evaluation. The name stuck in the Dominion's military lexicon like a splinter, Eclipse Syndrome. Back aboard the Vigilant Eclipse, the crew toasted the operation with cheap Terran whiskey and replayed the black box footage on a loop. Calder raised his glass. To the 9th Striking Wing, he said, "May their therapy bills bankrupt their government." No one bothered to correct him. It started with the Dominion survivors, but the paranoia didn't stay confined to them. You couldn't keep something like that under wraps. Not in a galaxy where information leaked faster than coolant from a damaged reactor core. Even with the Dominion censoring reports, seizing ship logs, and threatening crews into silence, the story of the Vigilant Eclipse seeped into the galactic consciousness like a rumor about poisoned water. It was never told the same way twice. In one version, the Eclipse was a massive dreadnought that could phase through matter and appear inside fleets like a ghost stepping through a wall. In another, it was a fleet of cloaked ships crewed entirely by psychic assassins. One particularly dramatic retelling, clearly the work of someone who'd been into the Andorran spice too long, insisted it was a rogue AI warship haunted by the consciousness of every enemy it had ever destroyed. The Eclipse's crew didn't discourage any of these versions. Why would they? Every embellishment made the real truth harder to find, and every new rumor gave the paranoia more places to hide. Alien intelligence agencies reacted about as well as you'd expect by panicking quietly in expensive conference rooms. Counterintelligence branches started seeing Eclipse in everything. Fleet exercises would be halted because a ship's sensor ghost fit the profile. War colleges held classified lectures on potential human deception platforms that consisted mostly of guessing and drinking heavily. And in a move that Calder found particularly hilarious, the Keltari Empire even began training officers to resist psychic suggestion, which was adorable given that nothing about the Eclipse's method was psychic. The real masterpiece was the way it began to bleed into every navy, even those that had never fought humans. A Malorian cruiser misread its own engine signature during a patrol must be Eclipse interference. A cargo ship lost half its shipment of fruit somewhere between ports. Clearly, the Eclipse was testing food supply sabotage. Fleet officers began demanding visual confirmation of every vessel in formation, which would have been a reasonable precaution if the Eclipse had ever bothered to be there in the first place. The phrase Eclipse Protocol became a standard order. On paper, it meant double-check targeting, verify comms, cross-confirm all sensor data. In practice, it meant second-guess everyone around you until the only thing you trust is your own breathing. Some fleets took it further, instituting measures like rotating command every 2 hours to prevent loyalty drift or locking down comms entirely so no one could fake orders. This had the delightful side effect of making their actual combat readiness collapse faster than a cheap tent in a windstorm. The Galactic press got in on it too. At first, the coverage was skeptical, laughing off the stories as Dominion face-saving. But skepticism doesn't sell as many HoloStream subscriptions as raw, undiluted fear. Soon headlines were screaming, "Invisible human warship strikes again. And is your fleet safe from the Eclipse?" Entire news specials ran reconstructions of battles that the Eclipse hadn't even been within 6 systems of. One popular network aired a 2-hour documentary where the host claimed to have intercepted a coded Terran message from the ship itself, which turned out to be Calder ordering more coffee. It became a cultural phenomenon. Merchants were selling "I survived" the Eclipse shirts to tourists. Kids on frontier worlds played a game called Black Box Tag, where one child would pretend to be the Eclipse and the others would accuse each other of betrayal until someone started crying. Naval recruitment ads had to start reassuring applicants that fleet service is safe from human mind tricks, which of course had the opposite effect. Meanwhile, in places that actually mattered, the political fallout was chaos wrapped in more chaos. Some governments took the threat as proof that humanity had to be isolated, sanctioned, and contained. Others decided they wanted in on whatever tech the Eclipse was using and began quiet diplomatic feelers toward Terran space, offers of alliance, trade, and in one case, marriage to a planetary heir. The Dominion, still smarting from its humiliation, doubled down on public bravado while privately rerouting funds into anti-hallucination countermeasures. They banned the phrase Eclipse Syndrome in official documents and replaced it with a far less catchy situational combat perceptual error cascade, which is exactly the sort of bureaucratic nonsense you invent when you're trying to make something sound less terrifying. No one used it. It was all working exactly as Calder and his crew hoped. The Eclipse didn't have to attack anyone for the fear to spread. The fear was doing all the work for them. Entire fleets began twitching at shadows, hesitant to fire in case they were being tricked. Training exercises ended with ships accusing their allies of treason, not because they'd seen anything, but because you never know with humans. The Vigilant Eclipse had become something more dangerous than a warship. It was a shared nightmare. And the thing about nightmares was they didn't have to be real to hurt you. They just had to be believable enough to keep you awake at night. Calder summed it up best during one of the crew's late-night viewing parties of intercepted alien news feeds. They were watching a particularly overwrought Kaltari broadcast in which the host, standing in front of a holographic star map, traced imaginary incursions by the Eclipse into 17 separate systems. It was, as far as the crew knew, entirely fabricated. See, Calder said, taking a sip of coffee, "We're winning without lifting a finger. All we have to do is keep breathing and let them write the horror story for us." And breathe they did. Somewhere out there, Half a dozen fleets were rechecking their own weapon safeties for the fourth time in an hour. Somewhere else, a planetary defense commander was canceling leave rotations just in case. None of them had seen the eclipse. None of them ever would. But in their minds, the ship was always out there, silent, unseen, waiting. That was the real victory. It happened without warning, which was fitting. No countdown. No ominous broadcast. No smug "we are about to reveal your deepest, most humiliating secrets" message. Just one day, every major data network in the galaxy lit up with a new file, tagged only with a timestamp and 2 words: Vigilant Eclipse. The file was enormous, petabytes of raw combat footage, logs, comms, and sensor feeds. No encryption, no watermark, no demands. Just sitting there, free for anyone to download. The galaxy being the galaxy, half the population tried to ignore it, the other half dove in like raccoons at a buffet. And within hours, everyone was watching. It wasn't just battle records, it was their battle records. Every fleet the Eclipse had ever visited was in there. Complete black box replays from ships that had been lost, scrambled, or mysteriously incomplete in official archives. Except now, those replays were edited with a kind of artistic cruelty that could only have come from humans. The Dominion's 9th striking wing? Front and center. Multiple angles. Slow motion of the flagship captain screaming orders at his own destroyer. A freeze frame as the destroyer returns fire, paired with the caption, "Best friends forever." They even cut in an audio replay of the Admiral's last line, "The humans aren't even here," looped over a Johnny Terran jazz track. The Varkel weren't the only stars of the show. A Malorian patrol squadron's catastrophic friendly fire incident was set to a Terran children's song about sharing. The Lorash Collective's phantom boarding action footage, where they'd spent 23 minutes shooting at empty corridors, had been tastefully underscored with canned audience laughter. One particularly disastrous Kaltari wargame, where they'd managed to sink their own flagship before the exercise began, was presented in a split screen. On one side, the hallucination they'd been seeing. On the other, the actual wide shot of them unloading everything they had into empty space. It was less a data dump and more a galaxy-wide roast. People laughed. Oh, how they laughed. Civilian sectors ate it up. Memes exploded overnight. Merchants started selling novelty mugs with screenshots of alien admirals mid-breakdown. Recruitment for Terran Navy surged, because apparently join the ship that makes entire fleets cry was more appealing than any promise of adventure or honor. But the ones who had lived those battles weren't laughing. Entire military careers imploded overnight. Officers who'd sworn they'd been under attack were now immortalized in HD, firing wildly at nothing. Admirals who'd claimed enemy stealth tactics had to watch themselves surrender to a coffee thermos in the corner of their bridge, one of the Eclipse's more playful hallucination insertions. Governments scrambled to control the fallout. The Dominion tried to ban access to the file entirely, which of course only made it more popular. The Kaltari declared it human propaganda, but couldn't explain how the Eclipse had obtained internal ship feeds. The Lorash tried suing humanity for psychological damages, which was promptly laughed out of every court that didn't want to be added to the next compilation. Calder and his crew were, of course, glued to the spectacle. The lounge had been turned into a war room/theater, every screen showing a different live feed of alien news anchors choking on their words as they tried to spin the footage. Calder lounged in his chair, mug in hand, watching as a Varkel senator demanded military action against the Terran menace while the split screen showed that same senator, years ago, fleeing his ship in an escape pod because he thought the ceiling panels were full of human commandos. The crew wasn't just entertained, they were delighted. It was one thing to win battles. It was another to humiliate entire civilizations in front of the galaxy and make them do the rest of the damage themselves. The Eclipse had gone from ghost ship to cultural legend in a single upload. The brilliance was that the file wasn't just humiliation, it was proof. Proof that the Eclipse didn't need to fire a single shot to dismantle a fleet. Proof that Paranoia was the real weapon. Every Navy commander now had to train their crews knowing their troops might be facing themselves. And every officer knew that if they failed, it might end up on the next public reel, scored with human comedy music. Alien think tanks started producing frantic papers on cognitive warfare deterrence, neural threat mitigation, and cross-species perception integrity. Translation: expensive projects to stop their own crews from losing their minds. None of it worked because you can't invent trust in a lab, and trust was exactly what the Eclipse took away. And the best part? The Eclipse never claimed credit in words. No smug press conference. No official Terran Navy statement. The file was anonymous in every way that mattered, as if the galaxy had just found it. That let the legend grow even bigger. Was the ship still active? Was it a relic from some forgotten war? Was it watching right now? In a way, Calder thought they'd done more damage with that single upload than with every operation they'd ever run combined. Fear was useful, but fear and ridicule? That was corrosive. You could fight fear. You couldn't scrub the image of your admiral begging for his life from a coat rack out of your collective memory. A week after the drop, Calder was asked by one of the newer crew members why they'd done it. Why give up the advantage of secrecy? Secrecy was never the point, Calder said. Eyes on the news feed. Fear makes them hesitate. Humiliation makes them trip over themselves running away. He sipped his coffee. Now, they're fighting two enemies, us and their own dignity. My money's on the dignity giving out first. And outside, somewhere in the cold dark between stars, the Vigilant Eclipse drifted on, silent and unseen. Not hunting, not attacking, just waiting for the next fleet to start wondering if that faint shadow in the corner of their eye was just their imagination or the ship that would make them famous for all the wrong reasons.